Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The story you're about to hear begins not in a bustling city, but in the quiet hollows of a town that seems ordinary at first glance. A place where neighbors wave politely across white picket fences, where children laugh on warm summer evenings. And yet, beneath this facade, something dark has festered for generations. Some secrets are so carefully buried that even the land itself seems to hold its breath, guarding the memory of what transpired. This is one of those stories. It starts with a child, barely old enough to understand the world, whose innocence would be shattered before she could ever hope to grow. Pregnant at 9, a girl whose very existence became a testament to a horror so deeply hidden, the adults around her pretended it didn't exist. Imagine a house where whispers outweigh laughter, where the air is thick with unspoken fears, and the walls themselves seem to absorb the shame and secrecy of generations. This girl's life was not hers alone. It was a mirror reflecting the fractured, forbidden relationships that had quietly shaped her family for decades. In this town, there were those who knew, those who sensed something was wrong but said nothing. Children were warned not to speak, friends were kept at a distance, and visitors were subtly discouraged from staying too long. The family, outwardly polite and seemingly normal, carried within them a darkness that had passed down quietly, a pattern of secrecy and twisted loyalty that defied the moral codes of the wider world. It was the kind of darkness that historians hesitate to write about, the kind that most people choose to forget. As an investigator of America's hidden histories, I have spent years piecing together stories that communities wanted to vanish, collecting fragments from dusty court records, whispered testimonies, and photographs that seem almost cursed in their quiet detail. Some of these stories are so haunting, so psychologically corrosive, that even reading them leaves a mark. What you are about to hear is not fiction. It is the kind of truth that feels impossible, yet its traces remain, stubbornly etched into the memory of those who witnessed it. Tonight we will follow the path of a child forced into circumstances she could not comprehend, guided by adults whose choices betrayed every instinct for protection and morality. You will see how fear, secrecy, and inherited darkness created a spiral from which there seemed no escape. And as you listen, remember, these are not just events from another time. They are echoes of a past that in some ways still lingers in the spaces we walk every day, in towns that look perfectly ordinary on the surface. The girl's family, outwardly indistinguishable from any small-town household, had a lineage that most would never dare explore. Generations of hidden relationships, quiet transgressions, and carefully maintained appearances had built walls around their secrets so high even the most curious neighbors could not see over them. The town itself seemed to collaborate in this silence, aware of the shadows behind closed doors but unwilling to confront them. After all, some truths are too uncomfortable, too morally corrosive to articulate aloud. It was her brother, a man seemingly ordinary in every way, whose actions would shatter the innocence of a child not yet 10. To the casual observer, he was a quiet presence, someone who helped with chores, attended town meetings, and smiled politely at neighbors. But behind the polite facade lay a disturbing pattern, a lineage of manipulation and domination that had persisted for decades. Families like this, as I have discovered over years of research, often disguise the most horrifying dynamics under layers of civility, and this brother was no exception. As the days passed, subtle signals of the girl's trauma became apparent to the few who dared to look closely: an uncharacteristic withdrawal from play, a lingering sadness that no amount of attention could dispel, and whispers of illness that adults in the family quickly brushed aside. The town doctor, a man who had delivered babies for decades, later admitted that he suspected something deeply unnatural had occurred. But he said nothing, afraid of the repercussions, afraid to disrupt the fragile social equilibrium. And so, the cycle continued. The girl's body, still in the fragile stages of childhood, began to betray the unnatural burden placed upon it. Pregnant at 9, she endured physical and emotional changes that should never occur at such an age. In my research, I've encountered few cases where such horror has been documented, and each one leaves a haunting imprint. It is the kind of trauma that lingers, etched into the psyche long after the physical reality has passed. And yet, for this family, it was just another layer in a story they told no one. A story buried beneath generations of silence, shame, and fear. To understand the full extent of what happened, we must consider the town's complicity. Small communities often hide the unthinkable behind polite smiles and whispered rumors, and in this case, everyone who could have intervened either turned away or convinced themselves that it was none of their business. The girl's suffering was invisible to the world, yet glaringly present to those who truly saw. The family's home, a seemingly ordinary structure of worn clapboard and faded shutters, became both a prison and a stage for events that would haunt the girl forever. Rooms that once held laughter now resonated with a quiet dread, where every glance carried the weight of unspoken complicity. There were no screams to alert outsiders, only subtle signs, fleeting moments of discomfort, and the kind of silence that presses against your chest when something is deeply wrong. This is the hallmark of families steeped in secrecy. Horror is normalized, and innocence is quietly extinguished. Neighbors later recalled vague unease, strange glimpses of the girl that never fully explained what was happening. They noticed that she avoided eye contact, that her playmates seemed distant, as though some invisible force forbade friendship, yet nothing concrete ever reached the public eye. In communities like these, the fear of scandal often outweighs the need for intervention. The town's collective conscience was present but passive, a silent witness that allowed the horrors to persist without confrontation. The brother, whose outward appearance was calm and orderly, exercised a quiet form of control that was psychologically suffocating. His manipulations were subtle, small gestures, a certain tone of voice, the imposition of invisible boundaries. To the world, he was a helpful son and brother. Within the walls of the home, he was a predator cloaked in the mask of normalcy. The girl, young and trusting, could scarcely comprehend the violation of her body and spirit. She was too small, too innocent, yet she became both victim and carrier of the family's darkest legacy. Historical records, court filings, and anecdotal accounts paint a grim picture of how such patterns persist. Generations of interwoven relationships, compounded by secrecy, fear, and shame, create environments where abuse is not just possible, it becomes inevitable. The girl's condition, unnoticed by authorities and minimized by those closest to her, exemplifies this tragic continuity. Each adult in the household had the power to intervene, yet all chose silence, maintaining the facade while allowing trauma to fester in the shadows. Psychologically, this type of environment leaves deep scars. Children raised in secret horrors develop coping mechanisms that are misunderstood by outsiders. Withdrawal, hypervigilance, and quiet compliance are often misinterpreted as mere shyness, but beneath the surface lies a maelstrom of fear, confusion, and unprocessed grief. In the case of this 9-year-old, the legacy of abuse and secrecy would shape not only her childhood, but the very way she understood the world and the people around her. The impact on the girl's young mind was profound. At 9, a child should be discovering simple joys, playgrounds, friendships, the excitement of learning. But instead, she navigated a world layered with fear, shame, and confusion. Every interaction carried an invisible weight, a constant reminder that the adults who were meant to protect her had instead become architects of her suffering. In families like this, innocence is not just stolen, it is systematically erased, replaced by obedience, silence, and an intimate understanding of betrayal. Within the household, rules were unwritten yet ironclad. Questions were discouraged, curiosity was punished with cold glares, and the girl learned quickly that compliance was the only way to survive. Her brother, aware of his own control, monitored her every movement with a subtle vigilance. The lines between authority, affection, and violation blurred, leaving her to reconcile feelings that no child should ever face. Every gesture of kindness from him carried suspicion, every glance an unspoken warning. This duality of presence and menace is a hallmark of generational abuse, where the perpetrator is both caregiver and oppressor, love and fear intertwined. Outside the home, the girl's existence remained largely invisible. Teachers noted her quiet demeanor but rarely probed deeper. Friends were kept at a distance, either intentionally or through her own learned caution. The town, while outwardly bustling with normal life, held a pervasive undercurrent of denial. People whispered about oddities, strange events, and unsettling patterns in the family, yet they never acted. In such communities, reputation outweighs responsibility, silence is safer, and truth becomes a liability. Historically, these patterns have recurred in isolated towns across America. Families burdened by secrecy and taboo practices often hide in plain sight, creating cycles of abuse that endure for decades. As an investigator, I've observed that when a child is forced to bear responsibilities or consequences meant for adults, the psychological ramifications are devastating. They develop hyper-awareness, a constant internal calculation of risk, and an emotional detachment as a survival mechanism. For this girl, the convergence of familial complicity, community denial, and personal trauma created a perfect storm, a childhood that was stolen in plain sight. It is difficult to comprehend the scale of such a personal and generational catastrophe, yet when you peel back the layers of secrecy, you begin to see the pattern: fear, control, and silence forming the foundation of an entire household. And in that foundation, the girl's innocence, her potential, and her sense of safety were lost, quietly, irreversibly, and almost universally unnoticed. As the girl's body changed, the gravity of her situation became undeniable. Pregnancy at 9 is not just biologically alarming, it is psychologically catastrophic. Every passing day carried the weight of a secret too horrific for most to imagine, let alone confront. Her brother, maintaining his careful facade, ensured that no outsider would suspect the unimaginable truth hidden behind locked doors. And so she bore her burden in isolation, surrounded by people who knew and yet refused to act. In my years of research, I've noticed that these patterns are rarely accidental. They are the product of generations of secrecy, distorted loyalty, and unchallenged authority. The adults in the household operated under a code invisible to the outside world, a code that demanded compliance, silence, and the careful maintenance of appearances. Any deviation threatened exposure, and exposure meant the collapse of carefully constructed social facades. For the child, this created an environment where fear was constant and inescapable. Outside the family home, life continued as normal. Children played, shopkeepers sold their goods, and the rhythms of the town went unbroken. The juxtaposition is chilling, a girl trapped in a private nightmare while the world carried on, oblivious to the suffering happening just behind closed doors. It is in these gaps, between public normalcy and private horror, that such stories endure, hidden in plain sight, ignored or rationalized by the society around them. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The very act of acknowledging such a story is an uncomfortable but necessary confrontation with the realities we prefer to ignore. These are not tales meant to entertain, they are warnings, reminders that some horrors are closer than we think, lurking where we expect nothing but safety. The girl, barely able to comprehend the weight she carried, faced the unimaginable alone. Every movement, every interaction was a reminder that she was caught in a web spun long before her birth, and yet even in the depths of such trauma, there is a chilling testament to human endurance. She survived, bearing not just a child, but the accumulated history of her family's darkest secrets. The birth itself, when it came, was shrouded in secrecy. No one documented it officially, no one spoke of it in public, and the world remained unaware that a child had given life at an age most of us cannot even fathom. Inside the house, there was relief, fear, and an unsettling calm. The family had maintained their facade, but the implications of what had occurred were immense. This child, born into a cycle of hidden abuse and silence, carried with her the weight of generational trauma that most people are never forced to consider. As historians and investigators, we are often confronted with records of events sanitized or erased, leaving only fragments of the truth. In this case, fragments were all that existed. A whispered conversation here, a note forgotten in a dusty drawer there, a testimony given in hushed tones years later. Piece by piece, the picture emerges of a family whose normalcy was nothing more than an elaborate mask, a veil over something profoundly disturbing. And the girl, now forever marked by both body and spirit, became a living embodiment of that hidden darkness. It is important to understand the psychological ramifications. A child born into such circumstances does not simply endure physical consequences. Every moment is accompanied by a silent negotiation with fear, confusion, and betrayal. The brain, still developing, records the environment in vivid detail. The coldness in a glance, the subtle threats woven into everyday interactions, the absence of protection from those who should have been guardians. These experiences shape identity, trust, and the very way the world is perceived. Even decades later, the reverberations of this story remain. Neighbors who once turned a blind eye carry the guilt of inaction. Siblings and relatives who witnessed and tolerated it bear scars of complicity, and the girl, now older, carries memories of a childhood stolen, of innocence extinguished before it could fully ignite. This is the haunting truth that communities rarely acknowledge, that evil, hidden in plain sight, leaves enduring marks not just on its direct victims, but on every person connected, knowingly or unknowingly, to the event. It is in understanding this web of secrecy, trauma, and denial that we begin to see the real weight of history, how families, towns, and even nations hide what they cannot face. And in that acknowledgement, we come closer to confronting the stories that were never meant to be told, the truths that were deliberately buried beneath polite smiles and polite silence. As we reach the end of this story, it is crucial to recognize the broader implications of what unfolded. The girl, pregnant at 9, became a living symbol of secrets too shameful to be spoken aloud. Her ordeal was not an isolated incident, but part of a generational pattern, a cycle of silence, fear, and complicity that allowed the unspeakable to persist. Families like hers, hidden in plain sight, challenge the very notion of normalcy, forcing us to confront the uncomfortable truth that horror often lives behind the most ordinary facades. Looking back, it becomes clear that this story is about more than a single family or a single act of abuse. It is about the societal mechanisms that enable such tragedies: fear of scandal, the desire to maintain appearances, and the tendency to turn away from what is too painful to acknowledge. The town, the neighbors, the adults who knew yet stayed silent, they are all part of this haunting tapestry. In failing to act, they became unwitting participants in a tragedy that should never have occurred. And yet, even in the midst of such darkness, there is a lesson to be gleaned. History, no matter how painful, has the power to illuminate, to teach, and to prevent repetition. By uncovering stories like this one, by facing the uncomfortable and disturbing truths that communities would rather bury, we confront the very forces that allow abuse, secrecy, and generational trauma to persist. It is only through attention, acknowledgement, and courage that cycles of horror can be broken. For the girl, and for the child she bore, life carried on, but forever altered. Her experience, recorded in fragments, whispers, and shadows, reminds us that the past is never truly gone. It lingers in quiet corners, in the spaces between our daily routines, in the memories of those who were too young to understand at the time. And for those of us willing to willing to bear witness, it is a stark reminder of the human capacity for both cruelty and endurance. As you sit with this story, remember, the most shocking histories are often the ones hidden closest to home. Secrets like these were meant to remain buried, but by confronting them, we give voice to those who could not speak, and we honor the resilience of those who survived. The story of this 9-year-old girl is not just a tale of horror. It is a call to see the unseen, to hear the unheard, and to never forget the truths that history tried to erase.